The late afternoon sun of a particularly warm Sunday in October spilled across the hardwood floors of our home in Willow Creek, casting long, amber-colored shadows that seemed to stretch into eternity. It was the kind of silence that one usually finds comforting, a domestic stillness that signaled a decade of shared rhythms and quiet understandings. I remember the scent of the Earl Grey tea cooling on the side table and the distant, rhythmic whir of a neighbor's lawnmower 2 streets over. Everything about the environment suggested stability. My wife, Clara, had mentioned she was heading out to the garden to prune the hydrangeas before the evening chill set in. I was in my glass-walled study, reclined in the leather chair that had seen the birth of my best architectural designs, feeling a sense of profound, if perhaps unearned, contentment. The house was our sanctuary, a 3-bedroom craftsman we had spent years restoring, every tile and every paint color chosen through a series of compromises that eventually became our shared language. It was a masterpiece of domesticity, or so I believed in that final hour of my old life. The phone rang, breaking the golden lethargy of the room. It was Silas, an old friend from my university days who had recently undergone a messy, soul-crushing divorce. He was in a state of cynical spiraling, questioning the very concept of long-term commitment. As I listened to him rail against the perceived cages of matrimony, a strange, reckless impulse took hold of me. Perhaps it was a desire to sound profound, or maybe it was a subconscious attempt to distance myself from his misery by performing a sort of intellectual detachment. Whatever the catalyst, I leaned back, looked out at the swaying trees, and let a sentence slip through my lips that would serve as a hand grenade in the middle of my living room. I said to him, quite clearly and without a hint of hesitation, "The truth is, Silas, I've spent the last 10 years wondering if I only married Clara because I was too exhausted to look for someone who actually challenged me. It wasn't love. It was just the path of least resistance." I laughed a dry, hollow laugh, feeling a momentary surge of ego as I dismissed a decade of devotion for the sake of a clever-sounding point. The silence that followed on the other end of the line was nothing compared to the silence that suddenly radiated from the hallway just outside my study door. I heard the distinct, sharp intake of breath, a sound so small it should have been lost to the wind, yet it rang out like a gunshot. Then, the soft, rhythmic thud of footsteps retreating toward the back of the house. The front door didn't slam. It clicked shut with a terrifying, clinical precision. I sat frozen, the phone still pressed to my ear, Silas's voice a distant buzz I could no longer process. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead, and walked into the hallway. The house felt wrong immediately. It wasn't just the absence of Clara, it was as if the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. The air was thin, oxygen-deprived, and the sunlight that had looked so golden moments ago now seemed harsh and revealing. I walked into the kitchen, where a pair of gardening shears lay on the counter next to a half-filled vase of water. She had been right there. She hadn't been in the garden yet. She had been coming in to ask me a question, or perhaps to bring me a cookie, or simply to be near me. Every object in the room, the hand-painted mugs, the magnets from our trip to coastal Maine, the small herb garden on the windowsill, suddenly looked like debris from a shipwreck. I called her name, my voice cracking, but the only response was the hum of the refrigerator. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a hollow shell, rejecting me with every creak of its floorboards. I waited for hours, pacing the length of the living room until the sun dipped below the horizon and the house was swallowed by a bruised purple twilight. At precisely 11:14 p.m., the notification chime of my laptop broke the oppressive quiet. I didn't even have to open the message to know what it was. The subject line was blank. The email was brief, devoid of the flowery prose or emotional outbursts that usually characterized our rare arguments. She wrote that she had heard every word I said to Silas. She didn't argue with my assessment, nor did she try to defend her place in my life. She simply stated that if our life together was merely a result of my exhaustion and a lack of better options, then she had been living a lie for 3,650 days. She told me she was staying with her sister and that I should not attempt to contact her. The finality of the text was chilling. There were no "I hate yous" or "how could yous." There was only the quiet, devastating erasure of a partnership. The following weeks were a masterclass in the quiet, final severing of two lives that had been meticulously woven together. There were no dramatic confrontations or weeping phone calls. Instead, there was the arrival of a moving truck on a Tuesday morning while I was at work, a logistical operation so efficient it felt surgical. When I returned home, half of the house was gone. Not just her clothes, but the things that made the house a home. The rugs she had found at estate sales, the books we had read to each other, the specific scent of her lavender candles. I walked through the rooms, seeing the pale rectangles on the walls where pictures used to hang. It was as if she were ghosting her own existence, leaving behind only the cold, hard edges of the furniture I had chosen. The legal papers arrived shortly after, served with a professional coldness that made me realize there was no path back. The bridge hadn't just been burned, the very earth it stood upon had been salted. I was left to drown in a sea of suffocating guilt that felt like a physical weight in my chest. Every morning I woke up and, for a split second, I would reach for her side of the bed, only to be met with the cold, taut sheets of a space that would never be filled again. I replayed that phone call 1,000 times in my mind, dissecting my own words with a surgeon's cruelty. I realized, too late, that what I had told Silas was a lie, a performance of cynicism meant to protect my own ego. I did love her. I loved the way she hummed when she was focused, the way she remembered exactly how I liked my coffee, and the quiet strength she brought to every crisis we had faced. But I had traded all of that for a moment of perceived intellectual superiority. The guilt was a constant companion, a dull roar in my ears that made it impossible to find peace in the silence of the empty craftsman house. I tried to find her. I drove to her sister's house in the neighboring town, only to find the gates locked and my calls blocked. I went to the small bakery where she spent her Saturday mornings, but the staff looked at me with a pity that felt like a slap in the face. They knew. Everyone knew. I sent letters that were returned unopened, their corners crisp and mocking. The trail was cold, not because she was hiding, but because she had simply ceased to exist in any world that included me. She had moved on with a speed that spoke of a deep, underlying resolve I had never fully appreciated. I was a stranger in my own life, wandering through a town that felt like a movie set after the actors had all gone home. Now, months later, I sit in the same leather chair in the study, the same autumn light filtering through the glass. But the house is no longer a sanctuary. It is a monument to a single, carelessly spoken sentence. The silence is no longer comforting. It is a haunting echo of the breath she took before she walked away. I can still hear the phantom sound of her footsteps in the hallway and the click of the front door. Every time I speak, I am terrified of my own voice, of the power of words to incinerate a lifetime of building in a matter of seconds. I am left with the architectural ruins of a marriage, a structure that looks perfect from the outside, but is hollow and cold within. The echo of my own betrayal is the only thing that remains, a permanent resident in a house that will never again be a home. I learned the hardest way possible that some things, once broken by the tongue, can never be mended by the heart. The silence is my only inheritance.